The wind swept across the plains with a lonely whistle, carrying dust, grit, and the scent of an early storm. It was the kind of night when even coyotes stayed silent, and the stars above looked sharp as needles. On the edge of that wilderness, a lone rider pressed onward. His name was Caleb Dawson, a cowboy known more for his quiet resolve than for his words. He wasn't a man who sought trouble, but out here in the borderlands, trouble had a way of finding a man whether he asked for it or not. Caleb had been riding since dawn, tending to his cattle along the dry creek beds. His shoulders ached, his canteen was nearly empty, and his horse snorted against the wind. He was ready for the comfort of his cabin. 4 rough-hewn walls and a fire that cracked just loud enough to remind him he was still alive. But on that night, just as he crested the ridge above his land, he saw something strange. A figure stumbling along the narrow trail below, moving like a shadow against the pale dust. The figure swayed, then collapsed to the ground. Caleb pulled back on the reins, eyes narrowing. It wasn't often you saw strangers out here, and rarer still to see one traveling alone after dark. Cautiously, he dismounted and approached. His boots sank into the sand, spurs clinking faintly. When he reached her, he stopped short. It was a woman. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt, her lips cracked from thirst. She looked up at him, and in the moonlight, he saw her features, delicate, sharp, unfamiliar to most men of these parts. She was Chinese, a rarity on the frontier, and the terror in her eyes spoke louder than words. She whispered something, broken English, her voice trembling. "Please, no tell, no send back." Caleb glanced around, half expecting to see riders giving chase. But the plains lay empty and still. Only the wind, only her. He crouched down, offering his canteen. She drank in ragged gulps, as if every drop was a lifeline. "What happened to you?" Caleb asked, though he knew her answer might be more burdened than he was ready to carry. Her gaze darted toward the distant town, then back to him. She shook her head, clutching his arm with surprising strength. "Bad men, looking, kill me if they find." Caleb felt the weight of her words settle heavy in his chest. He could have turned away right then, left her to fate. After all, this was no place for kindness. The frontier rewarded survival, not mercy. But something in her eyes stopped him. Something raw, desperate, human. He lifted her carefully to her feet. "Come on," he said. "My cabin's not far." She staggered beside him, leaning against his arm as they reached his horse. Caleb swung her up into the saddle, steadying her as if she were made of glass. Then, leading the horse by the reins, he walked them both down the ridge, toward the glow of his cabin lantern flickering faintly against the darkness. Inside the cabin smelled of pine wood and smoke. Caleb eased her onto a chair by the fire. She shivered, though the flames licked warm against the logs. He fetched a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders, noticing the bruises on her wrists, the torn edges of her sleeves. Whoever she'd been running from hadn't spared her cruelty. She murmured something softly in her own language, eyes fixed on the fire as if afraid it might vanish. Caleb didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone, gratitude mixed with fear. He ladled stew from the pot he kept simmering and set it before her. She hesitated only a moment before eating, each bite as if she feared it might be her last. For a long while, they sat in silence. The crackle of the fire filled the gaps where conversation might have lived. Caleb leaned back, hat resting on his knee, studying the stranger who had all but fallen onto his land. Finally, she looked up, voice trembling. "My name is Mei Lin." Caleb nodded once. "Caleb." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed on the edge of saying more, then shook her head as if the story behind her eyes was too heavy to share. But Caleb didn't press. He could tell enough already. She was running, she was hunted, and by bringing her here, he had put a target on himself. Outside, the wind moaned low, rattling the shutters. Caleb's instincts itched. Somewhere in that dark night, he felt eyes, ears, whispers carried on the breeze. He knew the frontier wasn't kind to strangers, and it was even less forgiving to a man who sheltered them. Still, as he watched Mei Lin drift into uneasy sleep by the fire, Caleb knew he had made his choice. For better or worse, he had offered her shelter. And choices like that had a way of demanding payment in blood. Dawn broke over the plains with a pale, cold light. The horizon glowed faintly orange, but the wind carried no warmth. Caleb Dawson stepped outside his cabin, hat low against the morning gusts. His cattle grazed in the distance, their silhouettes moving like shadows against the scrubland. But Caleb's thoughts weren't on his herd. They were on the woman sleeping inside. When he'd found her, she had been half frozen, desperate, terrified. Now she rested under his roof, a stranger with secrets that could bring the world down on both of them. Caleb knew the way this land worked. Word traveled faster than horses. If anyone had seen her wandering, it would not be long before rumors reached town. He returned to the cabin and found Mei Lin stirring by the fire. Her eyes darted around as if she expected to wake in chains instead of under a cowboy's roof. Caleb poured her a tin cup of coffee. She accepted it with both hands, bowing her head slightly. The steam curled into her face, softening her expression. "Where were you headed?" Caleb asked. His voice was low, steady, though he already suspected she had nowhere left to go. She hesitated. "No place, just away." Caleb studied her in silence. The way she held herself told him more than words. This was a woman accustomed to running. Her shoulders tensed at every sound. Her eyes flicked toward the door as though she expected it to burst open at any moment. Finally, she whispers, "Men from town. They want me gone, or dead." Caleb frowned. He'd seen the way settlers treated anyone who looked different, anyone who didn't fit into their narrow notion of belonging. Chinese immigrants had come to the frontier in search of work, railroads, mines, laundry houses. They worked harder than most, but instead of gratitude, they often earned suspicion and hatred. "Why?" he asked. Mei Lin's fingers tightened around the tin cup. "Because I live, because I am here." She looked at him then, her dark eyes shimmering with anger beneath the fear. "One man, powerful. He say I belong to him. I say no, I run. Now, others join him. 70, maybe more. Settlers. They hunt me." The number hit Caleb like a hammer. 70 settlers against one woman. And now, if he chose to protect her, against him too. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the embers. Every instinct screamed to send her away, to wash his hands before her troubles became his own. But there was something about her resolve, the quiet fire in her voice, that cut through his hesitation. "Then you'll stay here," Caleb said at last. "At least until you get your strength back." Her eyes widened, searching his face as though to test if he meant it. When she saw no lie there, she bowed her head. "You risk much." Caleb shrugged. "Done worse things in my time." That afternoon, Caleb saddled his horse. Supplies were running low, and he needed flour, salt, and ammunition. But he didn't like the idea of leaving Mei Lin alone. Thoughtful, "You'll be safe," he told her. "Keep the door barred. Don't answer for anyone but me." She nodded, though her hands trembled as she slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. Caleb rode into town, dust rising behind him in the heat of midday. The main street buzzed with activity. Wagons creaked past, horses tied to posts, men shouting from the saloon. But beneath the ordinary noise lay something heavier. He felt eyes follow him as he dismounted outside the general store. Inside, Caleb tipped his hat at Mr. Rollins, the storekeeper, and began gathering what he needed. Rollins hesitated before speaking, his gaze sharp. "You hear the news?" Rollins asked, lowering his voice. Caleb shook his head. "Stranger's been spotted. Chinese woman. Folks say she's trouble." Caleb kept his face blank, though his gut twisted. "Don't know anything about that." Rollins leaned in. "Best keep it that way. Some of the ranchers are riled up, claims she's a thief, a witch, a whore. They're stirring men to act." Caleb paid for his goods and left without another word. But as he stepped outside, he caught sight of Ezekiel Harper, a broad-shouldered rancher with a cruel smile and too much influence in town. Ezekiel watched Caleb like a wolf circling a calf, eyes narrowing, suspicion brewing. Caleb tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode out without looking back. But he knew the damage was done. Ezekiel had seen him, And Ezekiel didn't miss much. When Caleb returned to his cabin, Mei Lin rushed to the door at the sound of his horse. Relief softened her features when she saw it was him. He carried the supplies inside, setting them on the table. But he didn't mention what Rollins had said, nor Ezekiel's stare. No use filling her with more fear. Instead, he handed her a loaf of bread and said, "We'll eat well tonight." She smiled faintly, and for a moment the weight of her burden seemed lighter. But outside, across the plains, whispers were gathering, carried from one ranch to the next. The settlers were restless. And before long, their eyes would turn toward Caleb Dawson's cabin. The saloon at Dry Creek was always noisy come sundown. Laughter spilled through swinging doors, boots thudded against wooden floors, and the smell of whiskey and smoke clung to the rafters like a second roof. Caleb Dawson rarely stepped inside. He wasn't much for crowds, and he preferred the company of his herd over men who drank too long and talked too loud. But on this night, he had little choice. Ammunition was scarce, and the only way to get more was through a trader who did his business in the back corner of the saloon. Caleb tied his horse to the post and pushed through the doors. Conversation dulled for a heartbeat as eyes flicked his way. Then the noise resumed, though quieter, as though every man there had suddenly found something else worth whispering about. He made his way to the bar, ordered a coffee, the only thing that didn't burn his throat, and waited. That's when he heard it. At the far table, Ezekiel Harper leaned across to a circle of ranchers, his voice carrying over the music of the piano. "She's dangerous, I tell you," Ezekiel said, slamming his fist against the table. "One of them foreigners. Creeps into our land, our homes, spreading filth. You all heard what happened in Silver Gulch. A rancher's son dead. Folks say it was a woman like her who brought the sickness. We cannot let that kind of rot take root here." A murmur rippled through the men gathered around him. Some nodded, some frowned, but none spoke against him. Ezekiel had a way of bending a room, turning doubts into certainties. One of the younger ranchers asked, "You sure she's even here?" Ezekiel's smile was thin and cruel. "I've got it on good word. A cowboy out on the edge of town found her, took her in. Now he's hiding her under his roof." Caleb's grip on his coffee tightened. He kept his face still, but his mind raced. Word had spread faster than he imagined. 70 men, Ezekiel continued, raising his glass. "That's how many I can gather by week's end. We'll ride out together, send a message. Outsiders don't belong here, not on our land." The men cheered, slamming their drinks against the table. The piano played louder, but the notes were sharp, uneasy, as though the player himself knew blood was about to be spilled. Caleb finished his coffee in silence, set the cup down, and slipped out before anyone noticed him. But as he reached for his reins outside, a voice called after him. "Dawson!" He turned to see Tom Weaver, an older ranch hand who'd once worked alongside Caleb during a cattle drive years back. Tom's face was worn, but his eyes were steady. "Word is you've got a stranger out there," Tom said quietly. "Is it true?" Caleb met his gaze, saying nothing. Tom sighed. "Look, I don't care who she is, but Ezekiel? He's stirring men into a fire. He means to burn you out, Caleb. He'll come for you, and he won't come alone." Caleb nodded once. "I figured." Tom stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If I were you, I'd send her on her way. Tonight, before that mob gathers. Better to lose one stranger than your land, or your life." Caleb mounted his horse, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked down at Tom, his jaw set. "Can't do it. Not my way." Tom's shoulders sagged. "Then God help you, Dawson, 'cause no one else will." The ride back to the cabin was long, the plains darker than ever. Caleb's thoughts weighed heavy. He'd chosen his path, but each mile closer to home felt like a countdown. When he opened the door, Mei Lin looked up from where she sat near the fire, mending a torn sleeve with careful stitches. Her eyes searched his face. "Something wrong?" she asked softly. Caleb hung his hat on the peg, set his rifle by the door. "They know," he said simply. Her hands stilled, the needle slipping from her grasp. "They come?" He nodded. "Soon." For a moment, silence filled the cabin. Only the fire popped and crackled. Then Maylin straightened, her chin lifting. "Then we fight." Caleb blinked, caught off guard by the steel in her voice. "You've had enough fight," he said. Her gaze hardened. "I am still alive because I fight. If I stop now, then I am already dead." Caleb studied her, the firelight casting shadows across her face. She was small, fragile in appearance, but her spirit was unbreakable. And he knew then, if Ezekiel Harper and 70 settlers came riding for them, she would not run, she would stand, and so would he. Night fell over the plains like a heavy blanket, smothering the last remnants of light. Caleb Dawson stood outside his cabin, the wind whipping through his hair, eyes scanning the horizon. The fire in the hearth inside cast shadows that danced along the rough logs, but it could not chase away the dread tightening in his chest. He had spent the day fortifying the cabin, boards nailed over windows, extra firewood stacked near the walls, barrels of water and flour lined up in case the siege lasted longer than a few hours. His rifle rested against the doorframe, a silent promise that he would not surrender without a fight. Maylin moved silently behind him, carrying a small basket of candles. Her presence was calm but alert. She had grown stronger during her brief time with Caleb, though the fear in her eyes never fully disappeared. "Do you think they'll really come?" she asked softly, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He studied the horizon, where shadows moved like restless spirits among the distant trees. He didn't need to see the settlers to know they were coming. Rumors had a way of becoming reality on the frontier. "They're coming," he said at last, his tone flat. "And they're not here to talk." Maylin swallowed, glancing toward the cabin, as if it could shield her from what was coming. Caleb reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "We survived this," he said, "together. Just stay close and do exactly what I tell you." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. Hours passed. The wind howled. The night grew colder, the darkness deeper. Every sound, a twig snapping, a distant howl, set Caleb's nerves on edge. Maylin moved quietly, tending to the small fire in the hearth, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked. Around midnight, a noise reached them, faint at first, like the distant stamping of hooves on dry ground. Caleb's jaw tightened. He crept to the window and peered out, squinting into the gloom. Shadows were moving in the distance, figures on horseback clustered together, hundreds of boots against the plains. The settler mob Ezekiel Harper had promised was coming. Caleb counted silently, heart hammering. Dozens, maybe more, 70 men, just as the rumors had said. And now they were closing in. He returned to the hearth, voice calm though his blood raced. "They'll try to scare us first," he said, shouting threats. "Don't answer unless I tell you to," Maylin nodded, gripping the edge of the table. I can help," she said. "I can—" "You stay inside," Caleb said firmly. "If you're out there, it's over before it begins." "Trust me," she lowered her gaze, understanding the gravity of his words. The settler's shout soon rose in the distance, carried by the wind. "Out! Out with the stranger! Hand her over, Dawson!" Caleb moved swiftly. He checked his rifle, loaded the remaining rounds, and peeked through the cracks in the boards. Lanterns bobbed among the riders, illuminating angry, determined faces. Some were young men, some older, but all united in their intent. The first stones hit the cabin wall with dull thuds. Caleb's hands were steady, though his mind raced. He could not falter. The frontier was no place for hesitation. Inside, Maylin crouched behind the hearth. Her breathing was shallow, but she had obeyed him. She watched as he prepared for what might be the longest night of their lives. The mob's voices grew louder, threats, promises of violence, laughter that sounded hollow in the cold air. Caleb could hear the shuffle of hooves as they formed a circle around the cabin, their numbers intimidating, overwhelming. He raised his rifle, sighted the first shadow moving toward a window. His finger rested on the trigger. This was it. The storm had arrived. But even in the heart of fear, a strange calm settled over him. He had chosen to protect Mei Lin. He had chosen to stand. And now, no force on the frontier could make him turn away. The first shot rang out, echoing across the plains like a bell tolling doom. The night had swallowed the plains whole, and the first echoes of gunfire cracked across the air like rolling thunder. Caleb Dawson crouched behind the cabin wall, rifle poised, eyes flicking to every shadow. Lanterns bobbed outside, illuminating the mob of settlers, 70 strong, circling like wolves ready to pounce. Mei Lin sat low behind the hearth, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes followed every move Caleb made. Though she had promised to stay out of the fight, the firelight revealed a tension in her that betrayed a readiness to act if needed. Caleb had prepared as best he could, boards nailed across windows, barrels stacked near the walls, and a small cache of bullets within reach. Every plank, every nail, every measure of firewood counted. This night would not be won by luck alone. The mob shouted again, voices hoarse with anger and fear. "Come out, Dawson, hand over the woman, and maybe we'll spare your life." Caleb exhaled slowly. He had expected no mercy. The frontier was never kind, and those who sought justice through violence were relentless. But he had made a choice, to protect Mei Lin, no matter the cost. The first of the settlers surged forward, breaking through the shadows. Caleb fired, a sharp crack echoing across the plains. A man went down, and the others faltered, cursing, regrouping. The night was filled with the smell of gunpowder, the flash of fire against dark skies, and the thunder of hooves against dry earth. Inside, Mei Lin pressed herself against the floor, silent, heart hammering. Yet even here, even in fear, she had begun to understand Caleb's resolve. Every shot he fired, every movement he made, was deliberate. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for her life. The settlers regrouped, trying to flank the cabin. Caleb moved from window to window, firing when necessary, retreating when the boards splintered under their force. Each time he struck one down, another took their place. Hours passed, the night stretching endlessly, punctuated by the sounds of gunfire, the crash of boards, and the shouts of men on horseback. Caleb's muscles ached, his throat dry, yet he fought on. Each breath measured, each shot precise. Then came a new sound, the unexpected sound of dissent within the mob. One of the younger settlers argued with Ezekiel Harper, words raised, voices sharp, anger turning inward. Some men faltered, uncertain now, realizing that 70 against one cabin was not as easy as they had imagined. Caleb noticed the shift, taking advantage of the hesitation. He fired strategically, aiming to disarm and intimidate rather than to kill outright. Every shot, every move was calculated. Mei Lin helped in small ways, handing him ammunition, keeping watch at the interior windows, moving quietly but efficiently. By the time dawn began to tint the sky, the settlers were exhausted, many retreating back to the cover of the plains. Those who remained were demoralized, facing a cabin that had withstood their attack and a cowboy whose resolve had not faltered. Caleb lowered his rifle, wiping sweat and soot from his brow. Mei Lin stepped out from behind the hearth, her face pale but determined. The firelight reflected in her eyes, revealing relief, gratitude, and something deeper, a bond forged in the crucible of survival. The cabin was battered, boards splintered, windows broken, but it still stood. Caleb looked at the plains, scanning the horizon for any sign of return. The settlers had been taught a lesson. Force could not always bend what was strong. Mei Lin approached him, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "We survived," she whispered. Caleb nodded, a small, weary smile breaking through his fatigue. "Yes, we survived." The wind carried the distant cries of retreating men, the plains growing quiet once more. And though the night had been long and merciless, both of them had endured. Each scar, each bruise, each trembling heartbeat had been a testament to courage, determination, and the unlikely trust between a cowboy and a woman running for her life. Yet even in victory, Caleb knew the frontier would never forgive such defiance easily. Shadows lingered, whispers remained, and the cost of standing for what was right was a debt that often demanded payment in blood. He glanced at Mei Lin, now standing beside him, and thought about the choices that had brought them here. The choice to shelter, to fight, to endure. And he knew that no matter what lay ahead, they had faced the storm together and emerged alive. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, brushing the plains with pale gold. The wind was softer now, carrying the smell of smoke, dust, and charred wood. Caleb Dawson stepped out of the cabin, boots crunching over splintered boards and scorched earth. The battle was over. The settlers had retreated, beaten not just by gunfire, but by the stubborn resilience of a man who refused to bend. Mei Lin emerged from the cabin behind him, her face pale, bruised but unbroken. Her hands trembled slightly as she took in the aftermath. The scorched earth, the broken fence, the shattered silence that followed a storm of violence. Caleb didn't speak at first. Words were unnecessary. The air was heavy with what had happened, with what they had endured. He could feel every muscle in his body aching, every nerve still on edge from the relentless siege. Finally he spoke. "We made it." She nodded, eyes meeting his. "Thanks to you." He shook his head. "No, thanks to us. You didn't hide. You didn't run when it mattered. You helped. You stood with me." For a moment silence stretched between them. Then Mei Lin let out a small, tired laugh, one that seemed to carry the weight of the entire night. It was a sound of survival, of relief, of life reclaimed from the edge of death. The cabin, though battered, still stood. Caleb began inspecting the damage, noting the splintered boards, the scorched logs, and the broken window panes. It would take days to repair, perhaps weeks, but it was repairable, unlike the bonds that had formed overnight between him and Mei Lin, forged in the fire of violence and fear. Outside, the plains were quiet. No shouts, no hooves, no threats. Just the wind whispering through the tall grass, carrying with it the distant calls of birds resuming their day. Caleb breathed deeply, tasting the clean, cold air, knowing that though the frontier could be cruel and unforgiving, sometimes courage and steadfastness could carve a sanctuary in its heart. Mei Lin moved beside him. "What now?" she asked, eyes scanning the horizon as though expecting another threat to appear. Caleb placed a hand on her shoulder. "Now we rebuild, we survive, and we make sure that no one ever drives you from your life again." She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her weariness. "I never thought anyone would risk so much for me." "You'd do the same," Caleb said. For a long while they stood in silence, watching the sunrise. The frontier was wide and wild, dangerous and unforgiving, but in that moment it was also theirs. A man and a woman, survivors, bound together by the night they had endured. As the day began in earnest, Caleb knew the town would not forget what had happened. Ezekiel Harper and his followers would carry tales of the siege back to Dry Creek. Tales of a stubborn cowboy and the woman he protected. Rumors and resentment might linger, but Caleb didn't fear them, not anymore. He had made a choice and he had kept it. Mei Lin finally spoke again, voice quiet but steady. "Will they come back?" Caleb looked at the horizon, where the plains stretched endlessly. "Maybe. But they'll think twice now. They'll remember we stood and we survived. Sometimes that's enough." She nodded, understanding more in that moment than she had in days. Life on the frontier was harsh. Life on the plains was unpredictable. But courage, loyalty, and compassion, those were constants. And they had proven that even in the darkest of nights, those constants could prevail. Caleb glanced at her one last time, seeing not just a survivor, but a companion, a friend, someone who had faced the storm with him and come through stronger. The cabin might have been battered, the plains might have been dangerous, but for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt a quiet sense of peace. They had endured the night, and now the sun rose on their survival. And as they stepped inside to rebuild, to tend the wounds of the night, and to plan for the days ahead, one truth remained: bravery and compassion, even in the face of overwhelming odds, could carve a sanctuary in the harshest of lands. The frontier would continue to test them, as it tested all who dared to call it home. But for now, Caleb Dawson and Mei Lin had survived, and that was victory enough.